On a misty dawn in rural Montana, veteran farmer Ethan Walker thought it was just another quiet morning plowing his fields with his loyal German shepherd, Rex. But when the dog froze, ears pinned, growling at the earth itself, Ethan knew something was wrong. His plow had struck not stone, not metal, but the bones of a creature older than time. What lay beneath the soil was a skeleton so massive it could rewrite history and shake the world of science forever. This is a story of discovery, destiny, and a farmer whose stubborn hands unearthed the impossible. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from. Drop your country in the comments so we can see how far this story travels. The wind of Montana carried a sharp edge that morning, sweeping over the valley like a warning. Winter still lingered, though the calendar said spring, and the land bore the scars of frost and storms. The small town of Willow Bend rested at the foot of the Rockies, its houses weather-beaten, its roads cut by the tracks of old tractors, and its people hardened by years of fighting soil and sky alike. Here life was not gentle. It demanded sweat, patience, and a kind of faith that could withstand disappointment. Ethan Walker rose before dawn, as he always did. 61 years old, he was built like a man carved from the same timber beams that held up his barn. Broad shoulders, lean hips, a neck lined with cords of muscle. His face was weathered, every crease telling of both sun and battlefield dust. A salt and pepper beard framed a square jaw, and his eyes, pale blue and steady, seemed always to measure the distance to things unseen. His left hand bore a scar from a combat knife, stitched hastily years ago under desert fire, a mark that never let him forget. Ethan was a veteran who had served 2 tours in Iraq, one in Afghanistan. The wars had taken friends from him, carved away pieces of his youth, and left behind a silence that no medal could fill. When his father passed suddenly, Ethan returned to the farm, not because it was easy, but because it was the only place that felt honest. The fields were stubborn, sometimes barren, sometimes generous, but always demanding. They mirrored him in ways he could not deny. At his side walked Rex, his loyal German shepherd. 6 years old, Rex carried himself with the discipline of a soldier and the grace of a hunter. His sable coat gleamed with black across the back, fading into a warm tan along his legs. A thin scar traced down his left ear, the memory of a raid gone wrong, when doors splintered and chaos roared in foreign streets. His amber eyes were sharp, intelligent, and unyielding. To strangers, Rex was intimidating, his bark a thunderclap. To Ethan, he was family, a guardian, and the one soul who shared both war and home with him. The farmhouse behind them stood tired but unbroken. White paint peeled into gray flakes, windows rattled when the wind blew, and the porch sagged under its years. Yet Ethan looked at it not with sorrow, but loyalty. Every board and beam belonged to his bloodline. His grandfather had laid the first stones, his father had raised the barn, and now it was his turn to keep it alive. That morning, Ethan strapped on his worn leather boots, adjusted the brim of his faded navy cap, and stepped into the fields. The soil smelled of thaw and promise. Rex trotted ahead, ears flicking, nose pressed low to the earth as if reading its secrets. The tractor, a battered John Deere 4440, sat waiting, chipped paint and all, but still faithful. Ethan climbed into the seat with a grunt, turned the key, and listened as the engine coughed before settling into a steady growl. Before heading out, Ethan drove into Willow Bend's main street to pick up supplies. The town was small, a handful of shops and one gas station, the kind of place where everyone noticed when a truck pulled in. At Mason's Feed and Supply, the bell rang as he stepped inside. Behind the counter stood Linda Mason, the store's owner. She was in her mid-50s, tall and lean, her hair cut in a sensible bob the color of wheat stubble. Fine lines traced her face, softened by the warmth in her hazel eyes. Linda had a voice that carried authority without harshness, the kind that made children behave and men think twice. She greeted Ethan with her usual blend of humor and concern. "Morning, Walker. Got seed in yesterday. Barley that won't sulk like the last batch." "You'll want it." She handed him a clipboard, then glanced up. "And don't lie to me. You're still skipping dinner, aren't you?" Ethan smiled faintly, his lips barely moving beneath his beard. "I eat enough, Linda." "Don't you worry." She raised a brow, unconvinced, but let it go. Her store cat, a lazy calico named Ginger, leapt onto the counter and rubbed against Ethan's sleeve. Rex stood at the doorway, patient and still, though his eyes tracked every move the cat made. Later that morning, Ethan stopped for gas, where he ran into Deputy Caleb Ortiz. Caleb was in his early 40s, a compact man with a dark mustache, olive skin, and the calm eyes of someone trained to see danger before it arrived. Once a high school baseball star, his career had ended with a shoulder injury, pushing him toward law enforcement. Caleb respected Ethan without words. Soldier recognized soldier, even if their wars were different. "You keeping busy out there?" Caleb asked, resting a hand casually on the gas pump. "Busy enough?" Ethan replied. Caleb nodded. "That land's not easy, but neither are you." "Holler, if you need help." Ethan gave a small tilt of his head, the closest he came to thanks. Rex wagged his tail once, slow and deliberate, then turned back to the truck. By noon, Ethan and Rex were back at the farm. The sky had cleared into a hard, brilliant blue, the sun reflecting off patches of lingering snow. Ethan climbed onto the tractor, Rex leaping into the flatbed behind him. The plow lowered with a metallic groan, biting into soil that had not been touched since last season. Earth turned in dark ribbons, rich and damp, releasing the smell of life renewed. As the tractor moved in straight, patient lines, Ethan felt something settle in his chest. Here, in the rhythm of the plow and the steady presence of Rex, he found what the war had stolen: a sense of order, of purpose. He wasn't chasing ghosts anymore. He was tending the ground, the same ground his father and grandfather had bled for. Rex stood tall, ears alert, scanning the horizon. The dog seemed to share his master's belief that the land was more than dirt. It was inheritance, burden, and redemption all at once. Together, man and dog worked in silence, the kind of silence that heals. The sun dipped lower, painting the fields with gold. Ethan shut down the tractor, stretching his stiff shoulders, and looked across the land. For all its stubbornness, this place was his sanctuary. The scars of war still marked his body, but the soil beneath his boots promised something wars could not take: renewal. And so, on that first true day of spring, Ethan Walker and Rex plowed their field, not just for crops, but for memory, for healing, and for the hope that the earth could give back what life had taken away. The second morning of spring dawned brighter, though the cold clung to the air like a reminder that winter still owned part of the land. Ethan Walker rose at the same hour, his routine steady as the sun that crawled over the peaks. He moved through the kitchen with the precision of habit, poured black coffee into a chipped enamel mug, and stood by the window staring out at the fields where yesterday's furrows lay straight and proud. Rex, his 6-year-old German shepherd, sat at his heel, eyes fixed on his master's every move, tail tapping the floor like a metronome of anticipation. The dog had slept lightly, ears twitching through the night at distant coyote cries, and now carried himself with restless energy, as if knowing something awaited them in the soil. Ethan pulled on his canvas jacket, the seams darkened by years of use, and stepped into the crisp air. Frost clung to the grass like tiny knives catching the first sunlight, He adjusted his cap and made his way to the tractor. Rex bounded ahead, agile and powerful, his paws thudding against the earth with the rhythm of a soldier marching toward duty. Ethan climbed into the John Deere and turned the ignition. The engine grumbled awake, coughing before settling into its steady growl. The plow lowered, biting into the field once more. The work began smoothly. The soil rolled over in dark ribbons, releasing its earthy perfume. Ethan focused on the straightness of his lines, while Rex stood alert on the flatbed, amber eyes scanning the horizon. Hours passed, and the steady rhythm lulled Ethan into a calm trance, until suddenly the tractor shuddered, lurching forward before halting with a jarring crack. The plow had struck something beneath the ground. Ethan cursed under his breath and killed the engine. The silence afterward felt heavy, broken only by the creak of metal and the quickened thump of Rex's paws as he leapt down to investigate. The dog's hackles rose, a growl rumbling deep in his chest. Ethan climbed down, his boots crunching against the soil. He expected a buried boulder, a root, perhaps the rusted skeleton of an old farming tool. But as he knelt and brushed away clods of dirt with his calloused hands, his fingertips touched something cool, hard, and strangely textured. The surface was not stone. It had a pale, almost ivory sheen beneath the mud, rough in places, smooth in others, like the memory of scales carved into bone. Ethan fetched a shovel from the tractor and began to dig carefully. Rex stood beside him, barking once, sharp and insistent, as if urging him to pay attention. With every stroke of the shovel, more of the object revealed itself. A curve, a thickness, a form too large to belong to any deer or elk. It looked like a rib, massive and ancient, petrified into stone by the passage of time. Ethan's breath caught. He had seen bones before, human and animal alike, in deserts and alleys far from here, but nothing like this. This rib arched taller than his leg, embedded deep in the soil, as though the earth had swallowed a giant and only now chosen to give it back. He dropped to his knees and pressed his palm against the surface. It was cold, unyielding, yet it carried a weight that stirred something inside him. Wonder, disbelief, and a quiet fear. He dug further, sweat mixing with the chill air, his hands blistering against the wooden handle. Another bone surfaced, thicker, straighter, jutting out like a spear frozen in time. Rex barked again, circling the pit, tail rigid, ears forward, every instinct alive. Ethan paused, wiping mud from his beard, his heart pounding. He knew these were not the remains of any cattle buried by storm or plague. The size, the structure, the impossible scale whispered of something prehistoric, something older than the farm, older than the Rockies themselves. For a moment, Ethan thought of his father's words about the corner of land best left untouched. Perhaps the old man had sensed this presence, this sleeping relic underfoot. The thought made Ethan shiver. He stood, staring at the shadowed shape still half buried, and felt the wind press against him as though the land itself exhaled. By mid-afternoon the hole had widened. He uncovered fragments that looked like parts of a jaw, teeth the size of his fingers, serrated edges fossilized yet still sharp. The sight made him step back in awe. Rex barked louder, his voice echoing across the fields, drawing the attention of crows that lifted from the tree line in a dark swarm. Ethan knew the world had just shifted. His plow had not struck a stone. It had struck history, a creature's remains so vast that its very presence threatened to redefine the soil he had always thought of as his own. Ethan sat at the edge of the pit, chest heaving, staring down at the pale bones. The sun slipped lower, shadows stretching across the furrows like dark fingers. Rex pressed close to him, ears twitching, eyes still fixed on the hole, as if guarding whatever secret lay beneath. Ethan reached down, scratched the dog's neck, and whispered hoarsely, "What have we found, boy?" The wind carried no answer, but the earth had already spoken. The field was no longer just his inheritance. It had become the resting place of a giant, and uncovering it would change everything. The following days stretched long, measured not by clocks but by the scrape of shovels and the pounding of Ethan Walker's heart. Dawn spilled pale across the valley, and each morning he returned to the pit with Rex by his side, the dog's amber eyes bright and alert, as though he too understood the gravity of what lay beneath. The wind carried the scent of thawing soil and pine, while the mountains loomed like ancient judges silently watching the farmer dig into the bones of a forgotten age. Ethan worked with steady patience, sleeves rolled to the elbow, muscles straining under the weight of both earth and memory. His shirt clung with sweat despite the cold mornings, and blisters split across his scarred hands. Every swing of the shovel sent up clods of mud that clung to the edges of bone unlike any he had ever seen. Ribs curved higher than his chest, massive arcs of fossilized ivory. A jawline began to surface, lined with serrated teeth that gleamed under the thin wash of sun. Ethan crouched, breath fogging in the chill, staring at teeth longer than his fingers, sharp even in stone. Rex barked once, ears flat, tail stiff, his growl vibrating against Ethan's bones. At night, exhaustion weighed him down, but sleep offered no peace. Dreams dragged him back to deserts where explosions lit the sky and men he had once trusted bled into sand. The sight of those enormous bones in daylight pulled the same feeling from his chest: fear, awe, the certainty that he had stumbled into something too vast to control. He would wake, drenched in sweat, Rex pressed close against his legs, the dog's steady breathing grounding him to the present. On the third day of digging, Ethan paused to drink water from a dented canteen, leaning against the tractor's tire. His eyes traced the length of the bones now uncovered, stretching farther than he could measure. "You're no elk, no bison," he muttered, voice roughened by fatigue. "You're something else entirely." Rex sat nearby, head cocked, tongue lolling, as if listening for a name to give the creature. That afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the Rockies, a figure appeared on the dirt road leading to the farm. It was Henry Cole, Ethan's nearest neighbor, a man in his late 60s with a tall, angular frame that had grown wiry from decades of labor. Henry's skin was browned by sun and furrowed by time, his gray beard cropped close to a face shaped like an axe blade. His eyes were pale green, sharp but weary, carrying the look of someone who had spent a life watching crops fail and cattle die, yet still planting again the next year. Henry had a limp in his right leg, the result of a farming accident decades earlier when a tractor rolled and nearly crushed him. Since then, he walked with a cane fashioned from oak, and with it came a permanent wariness in his movements. "Walker," Henry called, voice gravelly as he approached. "You digging for gold out here?" Ethan wiped dirt from his hands and shook his head. "Not gold." He considered telling the truth, then chose silence. The bones felt too sacred, too strange to share so easily. Henry studied him for a moment, then his gaze slid to Rex, who stood rigid, hackles raised. "That dog of yours never did take kindly to visitors," Henry said with a dry chuckle. He tapped his cane twice against the ground, a habit he had whenever he sensed unease. "Well, whatever you're doing, don't break your back." Soil's stubborn this time of year. With that, he turned and limped back down the road, leaving Ethan and Rex alone again with the Earth's secret. As twilight deepened, Ethan returned to the pit and crouched beside the fossilized remains. His fingertips traced the arc of a rib, cool beneath the layer of dust. Memories of battle rose unbidden. The roar of engines, the metallic taste of fear, the sound of comrades lost to silence. Those same feelings stirred here, not in horror, but in reverence. He realized that just as war had buried pieces of his own soul, the earth had buried this creature, waiting for someone stubborn enough to uncover it. The following morning, Ethan brought out heavier tools. He wedged a pickaxe into the soil, careful to avoid the bones. Rex patrolled the edge of the pit, barking at crows that circled above, as though guarding the excavation. Slowly, vertebrae emerged, massive discs locked together like ancient gears. Ethan knelt and brushed dirt from them with his bare hands, unable to stop the awe in his chest. "This thing walked this land before we had names for it," he whispered. "Before towns, before fences, before us." He sat back on his heels, staring. The bones seemed to stretch forever, a skeleton larger than any truck, larger than the tractor that had uncovered it. Rex whined softly, lowering his head, his body pressed close to Ethan's thigh. The farmer rested a hand on the dog's fur, steadying himself. By evening, a new storm gathered along the ridges. The wind came cold and restless, carrying with it the smell of rain. Ethan covered the pit with a tarp weighted by stones, his heart thudding with both protectiveness and dread. As he stood, looking at the darkening sky, he thought of his father's warning. "That corner, we let it be." Now he understood. It wasn't just superstition. His father must have known the earth held something meant to stay hidden. But Ethan was not a man to leave truth buried. He had seen too much death to fear bones, too much history to turn his back on what could be remembered. As lightning forked across the mountains, he whispered into the storm, "If this is meant to be found, I'll be the one to find it." Rex barked once in reply, and the echo carried across the fields. The earth's secret was awake now, and Ethan knew there was no turning back. By the end of the week, whispers had already crossed Willow Bend faster than the prairie wind. Folks at Mason's Feed and Supply spoke in low tones, some with curiosity, others with laughter. A few old-timers scoffed that Ethan Walker had finally gone mad, spending his days digging holes in the back acres like a man searching for ghosts. Henry Cole had said nothing about what he'd glimpsed, but his silence only fanned the fire of rumor. Each day a pair of curious teenagers would ride their bikes near the property, craning necks before darting away at the sight of Rex's sharp bark and rigid stance. The German shepherd had become the pit's sentry, his chest deep with warning growls whenever strangers lingered too close. Ethan ignored the gossip. He rose with the sun, his back aching, his hands torn raw, and kept digging. The bones stretched wider than he had ever imagined, massive ribs curving like the frame of a cathedral, vertebrae locked in a spine that rolled across the soil like a buried bridge. The sheer scale left him breathless, but also restless. Each evening, staring into the pit under fading light, he felt the weight of a secret too large to carry alone. On a Monday morning, a pickup truck rattled up the dirt road and stopped near the farmhouse. A tall man stepped out, followed by a woman carrying a worn leather satchel. Ethan stood with arms crossed, Rex bristling at his side. The man introduced himself first. "Professor Leonard Harris, Paleontology, Montana State University." He was in his early 60s, broad in the shoulders despite a scholar's life, his gray hair brushed back from a strong forehead. Deep lines carved his face, particularly around the eyes, which held a sharp intelligence, softened by curiosity. He wore a canvas field jacket, dusty boots, and carried himself with the authority of someone who had spent decades commanding classrooms and field digs. His voice was low, deliberate, the kind of voice that weighed words before setting them loose. The woman beside him adjusted her satchel, and extended a hand. Dr. Claire Evans, assistant professor. She was in her late 30s, tall and slender, with chestnut hair tied neatly into a braid that hung over her shoulder. Her skin was fair, her cheekbones high, and behind her square-rimmed glasses burned a restless eagerness. Claire spoke quickly, her words tumbling with enthusiasm, betraying a personality impatient for discovery. Her long fingers gripped the satchel tightly, as though the notebooks inside carried treasures of their own. Ethan eyed them both cautiously. "How'd you hear?" Harris gave a faint smile. "In a town like this? News walks faster than men. Mr. Walker, may we see what you found?" Rex growled, the fur along his spine rising. Ethan laid a steadying hand on the dog's neck. "Easy, boy." He looked back at the professors. "Follow me." The three walked toward the pit, boots crunching over soil. When they reached its edge, Ethan stopped. Harris peered down, his expression freezing as his breath caught. Claire gasped audibly, pushing her glasses higher as she crouched to get a better view. The sunlight caught on the bones, revealing the massive curve of ribs, the line of vertebrae, and the jagged teeth set into a jaw large enough to swallow a man whole. Ethan remained silent, his jaw tight, waiting for their verdict. Finally, Harris spoke, voice hushed with awe. "Good God, it's a theropod, a carnivorous dinosaur. Judging by size, this is no small predator. Millions of years old, preserved right here under your land." He looked at Ethan with a mixture of reverence and urgency. "Do you realize what you've uncovered?" Ethan shifted his weight, uncomfortable under the intensity of their stares. "I realize it's not mine to ignore." That's all. Claire leaned forward, brushing away loose soil with her fingertips, though careful not to disturb the fossil. "The preservation is remarkable," she murmured, almost to herself. "Teeth still sharp, the rib structure intact. This could rewrite part of our understanding of migration patterns in this region." Her voice trembled with excitement. Rex pressed closer to Ethan, ears twitching, gaze fixed on the strangers as if judging whether they deserved to stand on this ground. Ethan rested his hand on the dog's head. He could feel Rex's muscles taut beneath the fur, a living reminder of loyalty amid shifting truths. Behind them, thunder grumbled over the peaks, though the sky above the field remained clear. Harris straightened slowly, his eyes never leaving the pit. "Mr. Walker, this discovery belongs not just to you but to history, to science. We'll need a team, proper excavation, permits." Ethan cut him off sharply. "I didn't invite a crowd. This is my land, my father's before me. I've fought enough wars to know what happens when too many hands reach for the same prize." For a long moment, silence pressed between them, broken only by the rustle of wind through dry grass. Harris studied Ethan carefully, his gaze steady but respectful. "I understand," he said finally. "But history doesn't ask permission. It only waits until someone digs deep enough to listen." Ethan looked down at the bones once more, his breath unsteady. Rex whined softly, nudging his leg. The truth settled heavy in his chest. He had unearthed more than bones. He had unearthed the echo of something vast, something that would not remain hidden. And standing at the edge of that pit, with scholars staring into the past and a loyal dog guarding his side, Ethan Walker realized the weight of history was now chained to him. The quiet rhythm of Ethan Walker's days shattered within a week of Professor Harris and Dr. Evans's visit. Word spread far beyond Willow Bend, carried by gossip, then by phones, then by headlines that seemed to bloom overnight. What had once been a solitary pit at the back of Ethan's farm became the epicenter of attention, a magnet for every kind of curiosity. Trucks rumbled down the dirt road, loaded with equipment, tents, and people whose shoes were not made for mud. Bright tarps rose like flags marking excavation sites. Students in khaki pants and hard hats moved in clusters, voices sharp with excitement. The field, once a sanctuary where only Rex's bark cut the silence, now hummed with generators, the clatter of metal stakes, and the drone of cameras. Ethan stood at the porch, arms crossed, a bitter taste on his tongue. He had agreed reluctantly, under Harris's steady persuasion, but the sight still unsettled him. His land, his father's land, was no longer his alone. Rex stayed close, ears perpetually alert, tail low, growl rumbling whenever a stranger wandered too near the farmhouse. At 6 years old, he was powerful, with a wolf-like gait and a soldier's discipline, but now he looked more like a sentinel than a farm dog. Children from town tried to approach him, reaching curious hands, but one sharp bark sent them retreating. Ethan did not apologize. Privacy was his last defense, and Rex was his wall. Among the crowd, certain figures stood out. There was Dr. Samuel Reed, a stocky man in his late 40s with a thick beard flecked gray and round glasses that constantly slipped down his nose. Reed had a booming laugh that echoed across the camp, but his temper was equally large. Students whispered about the time he'd been expelled from a dig in Utah after clashing with a local sheriff. Years of hardship had made him stubborn, but his brilliance was undeniable. He could identify fossil fragments with a glance, and his authority drew others like moths to flame. Then came Mayor Judith Harper of Willow Bend, a tall woman in her early 50s with broad shoulders, copper hair cut short, and a voice that commanded attention. She wore tailored jackets even on the farm, her sharp green eyes scanning everything with political calculation. Judith was ambitious. Once a lawyer, she had moved back to town after a divorce, vowing to turn Willow Bend into more than a forgotten dot on the map. For her, this discovery was not just science, it was opportunity. She spoke warmly in public, but Ethan noticed the steel beneath her words. Local reporters arrived first, their vans kicking up clouds of dust. One of them, Jack Miller, was a lanky man in his 30s with thinning blonde hair and a perpetual notebook tucked into his jacket. His face was narrow, his cheekbones sharp, and his eyes restless, always scanning for a story behind the story. Jack had made a career chasing scandals in small towns, exposing corruption where others looked away. He was polite enough to Ethan, but his questions cut like knives. "Mr. Walker, how does it feel knowing the bones on your land might belong to the state?" Ethan offered no answer, only silence, and Rex's low growl did the rest. The students fascinated Ethan most. Dozens of them, young men and women in their 20s, hunched over the soil with brushes and chisels, their faces alight with purpose. One in particular caught his attention. A girl named Emily Tran, slender and wiry, her black hair tied into a messy bun, skin olive-toned, her dark eyes full of fire. Emily was 24, a graduate student from California who had left behind a fractured family. Her father's expectations had been crushed when she chose fossils over finance. She carried herself with quiet defiance, shoulders square, jaw set, her hands moving with delicate precision as she unearthed each fragment of bone. Ethan respected her diligence, though he kept his distance. By the second week, tents filled the edges of his field, and the excavation grew deeper. Cameras captured every angle, scientists debated loudly over classification, and government officials drove in black SUVs to inspect the site. Ethan felt the land slipping from his hands like water through open fingers. At night, when the camp quieted, he sat on his porch with Rex pressed against his leg, staring at the glowing lanterns scattered across his field like strange new constellations. Pride warred with unease inside him. He had uncovered something magnificent, something that tied his soil to the dawn of the world. But in doing so, he had opened the gates to strangers, to institutions that would claim authority, to voices that spoke over his own. This discovery no longer belonged only to him. As he watched, a cold realization struck him. The field was no longer the field of memory. It had become a battlefield, between history and possession, science and sovereignty, pride and loss. Ethan did not yet know which side he stood on. Rex shifted, ears pricking at the sound of laughter from the excavation camp. Ethan scratched the dog's neck absent-mindedly. "We started this, boy," he murmured, "but I'm not sure how much of it we'll get to keep." The German shepherd pressed closer, silent but resolute, as though reminding him that whatever the world claimed, loyalty and land still ran deepest in the hands of those who had earned them. The paperwork came in thick manila envelopes, carried not by neighbors or reporters, but by men in pressed suits who did not smell of dirt. They arrived one morning in a government sedan, polished black with tinted windows, and walked up Ethan Walker's porch as though the farm had always belonged to them. Ethan stood waiting, Rex at his side, the dog's hackles raised, lips curled in a low snarl. The first man introduced himself as Daniel Whitmore, a lawyer for the state university. He was in his early 40s, tall and lean, with a face as pale as parchment and sharp cheekbones that made his expression look permanently disapproving. His dark hair was slicked back with precision, not a strand out of place, and his gray suit clung to him as if it had never known dust. He spoke with the crispness of a man who thought in contracts, his sentences clipped, exact, and carefully weighted. With him was Margaret Ellison, a state representative in her mid-50s. She had a wide frame, her auburn hair cut into a bob that framed a square, determined face. Her skin carried the soft trace of makeup applied to project authority, and her voice carried a firmness that brokered no argument. Margaret had spent years negotiating budgets and bills in Helena, and she treated Ethan's porch like a committee floor. "Mr. Walker," Daniel said, handing him a folder of documents, "these agreements will allow the excavation to continue under official oversight. In return, you will retain recognition as the discoverer. However, the site itself will be managed as state property." Ethan's jaw tightened. "So it won't be mine anymore." "It is still your land," Margaret cut in smoothly, "but certain protections are required. Fossils of this magnitude belong to history, not to any one person. You'll be compensated, of course." Ethan said nothing at first. Rex growled, his body tense, reading the strangers the way only a dog could. Ethan scratched the dog's neck, steadying him. He stared at the papers, the black ink letters crawling across the pages like ants stripping away his sovereignty. He had fought wars to defend land that was never his, and now his own inheritance slipped from his grasp, not with guns, but with pens. Still, he signed. One by one, his scarred hands pressed pen to paper, each signature heavier than the last. When it was done, Daniel tucked the documents into his briefcase with a satisfied nod, while Margaret shook Ethan's hand firmly as though sealing not just a deal, but a conquest. When they left, silence fell again on the porch. Ethan sat heavily on the steps, staring out across the fields. Rex lowered himself beside him, head pressed against Ethan's knee, amber eyes turned toward the excavation site, now alive with tents, lanterns, and voices. The dog growled once, a low warning, as though sensing that something precious had been taken from them. The days that followed brought more intrusion. Trucks unloaded floodlights that lit the field through the night, their glow painting the farmhouse in pale white. The once quiet farm now thrummed with generators, shouted instructions, and the clatter of tools. Reporters roamed like scavenger birds, cameras flashing, microphones shoved toward anyone willing to speak. Ethan withdrew from them all, answering only when forced, his words short, his face hard. Rex grew restless, pacing along the fence line, barking at strangers who wandered too close to the house. Children pointed and laughed at the fierce shepherd, but Ethan saw the truth in the dog's eyes. Rex understood this land was no longer theirs alone. One evening, Ethan stood at the porch as the sun bled into the mountains. The excavation glowed under electric lights, the massive skeleton rising from the soil like a cathedral of stone. Students brushed carefully at the ribs, their outlines glowing in the artificial brilliance. Dr. Claire Evans's voice carried across the field, excited, rapid, explaining some new fragment discovered. Professor Harris stood nearby, arms folded, gaze reverent. Ethan gripped the porch railing until his knuckles whitened. He had lost his privacy, his freedom, the quiet that once defined his life. Yet as his eyes followed the curve of bones larger than barns, awe stirred inside him. For the first time, he allowed himself to see it not as loss, but as calling. He whispered into the twilight. Words meant more for himself than for anyone else. Maybe this is why I came back. Maybe this is what God wanted me to do, give back something bigger than me. Rex pressed against him, warm and steady, his body humming with unspoken loyalty. Ethan scratched behind the dog's ears and allowed the weight of the day to settle. The farm was no longer his alone, but the truth it revealed, something that had slept for millions of years, was worth the sacrifice. As the stars emerged, glittering cold above the Rockies, Ethan accepted a truth he had fought against for days. Greatness always had a price, and he had just paid it. Months passed, and the land that once hummed only with the sound of tractors now roared with excavation machinery, voices of scientists, and the endless clicking of cameras. The skeleton slowly emerged piece by piece, lifted from the earth like a sleeping titan being carried into daylight. Each rib was catalogued, each tooth carefully wrapped, each vertebra numbered and placed into crates bound for the National Museum in Washington, D.C. Ethan Walker watched it all from a distance. He no longer strode through the pits. That space belonged to scholars and officials. His boots stayed near the fence line, his eyes following the procession of trucks as they rumbled away carrying history strapped under tarps. Rex sat beside him, ears flicking at the commotion, his body tense at every stranger who passed too close. The dog had grown grayer around the muzzle, his once youthful energy steadied into a soldier's patience. Still he kept guard, as though sensing that Ethan's silence hid wounds deeper than words. When the last piece was loaded, the excavation site fell quiet. The floodlights dimmed, the tents folded, and the students gone. The field stretched empty once more, scarred with trenches but strangely radiant in its solitude. Ethan stepped into the silence and felt it wrap around him like a long-lost coat. He bent, touched the dirt where the jawbone had once rested, and whispered something only the earth could hear. Weeks later, Ethan traveled to Washington for the unveiling at the Smithsonian's Hall of Paleontology. It was the first time he had left Willow Bend in years. The capital overwhelmed him, streets swarming with cars, buildings climbing skyward like cliffs of stone, people rushing without looking one another in the eye. He wore his only suit, a plain charcoal one that hung loose on his broad frame, and carried himself with the quiet composure of a man more used to rifles than microphones. The museum stood grand and white, its pillars gleaming under the sun. Inside, glass cases sparkled with treasures from ages past, but all attention was on the centerpiece, the reconstructed skeleton of the theropod. Towering above the crowd, its jaws opened in a permanent roar. It seemed less like a fossil and more like a ghost called back to life. Children gasped, parents pointed, and journalists scribbled furiously. Among the dignitaries, Ethan spotted a woman who approached him with kind eyes. She was Dr. Eleanor Price, director of the museum, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair tied neatly at the nape of her neck. Her posture was regal yet warm, her pale blue dress suit tailored but softened by the pearl necklace at her throat. She greeted Ethan with both hands clasping his, her voice gentle but assured. "Mr. Walker, without your perseverance, this discovery would still be sleeping in the earth. You've given the world a gift it cannot repay." Ethan shifted uncomfortably, his voice gravelly. "I only dug where the plow stopped," Eleanor smiled. "Sometimes that's all history asks of us. Be stubborn enough to keep going." Applause thundered as the ribbon was cut. Cameras flashed, questions flew, and Ethan stood in the background, Rex's leash looped around his wrist, the dog pressed steady against his leg. He did not crave the spotlight. He only needed to see the creature one last time, alive in bone, if not in breath. Returning home, the farm looked smaller, yet purer. The trenches had been filled, the floodlights removed, and the fields lay open under the sun. The barn still leaned, the fences still needed mending, and the soil still demanded toil. Ethan smiled faintly. Those tasks were his, not history's. He walked the boundary line with Rex at his side, the dog's paws sinking into the familiar dirt, the wind carrying the scent of hay and pine. As he paused at the far corner, Ethan gazed across the land and felt something stir inside him. War had taken his youth, his friends, his peace, but the earth had returned something in exchange, a legacy etched not in medals or scars, but in stone and story. He had uncovered more than a skeleton. He had uncovered proof that his life, his land, his stubborn labor mattered beyond himself. That night, Ethan sat on the porch, stars glimmering cold and eternal above the Rockies. Rex lay at his feet, head resting on his boots, breath slow and steady. Ethan lifted his gaze and whispered, "This land gave me more than I deserved. And now it will give long after I'm gone." The wind carried his words into the darkness, and for the first time in many years, Ethan Walker felt wholly at peace. Sometimes, the greatest miracles are not thunder from the heavens, but quiet revelations beneath our very feet. Ethan Walker thought he was only a tired veteran, plowing soil to keep memory alive. Yet God had chosen him to uncover a story millions of years old, a reminder that the earth itself carries the fingerprints of the Creator. Just as Ethan's plow struck a truth hidden in the ground, so too can our daily lives strike unexpected blessings if we remain faithful, patient, and willing to keep digging even when life feels heavy. We are reminded that every struggle, every scar, and every long night has a purpose. The Lord places treasures in places we least expect, sometimes in a neighbor's smile, sometimes in a child's laughter, sometimes even in the stubborn soil of our hardships. Ethan's story shows us that what feels like loss can, through God's will, become legacy. So, as you finish this story, take a moment to see your own field, whatever challenges or burdens you carry, and believe that something greater may be waiting just beneath the surface. Share this story with someone who needs hope. Leave a comment to tell us how God has surprised you in your own journey, and don't forget to subscribe so these messages of faith and courage can reach further. May the Lord bless you, keep you, and guide your plow straight, even through the hardest ground. And may His miracles, small or great, be revealed to you in His perfect time.